what about the person that walks around every day with melancholy, somebody just plain depressed? Is that somehow related to trauma, or as you call it, trauma?
Well, it can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Depression in and of itself can simply be that, depression. And it can be chemical, emotional. There are a variety of types of depression. It can be situational. So it's not necessarily a symptom of trauma. Where it becomes more related is that people who've experienced one of the forms of trauma will often have depression, but it's very often in combination with a number of other symptoms. It's not just depression. So there are people who simply experience depression, and when it's chemical, largely the chemistry in the brain, antidepressants work very well to help the person. When it is situational, so for instance, you lose your job and everything looks black. Generally, with changes in circumstances, the depression may lift. Some people, it simply is a result of a long history of things going badly for them and difficulty in relationships and that kind of thing. And then very often psychotherapy can be helpful because they're kind of sorting out what's going on with them at an emotional level. There are a number of different kinds of depression, and it arises from a number of different types of situations.
I appreciate that, and I guess I was looking for some sort of definition of maybe the spectrum of things that you might deal with as a therapist. And, I guess I'm putting trauma at the top of the list of the spectrum, and maybe down at the bottom of the list is somebody just feeling, listless, down, as we kind of say, I feel down today. That might be melancholy or something. If that's the bottom of the spectrum, then there's all kinds of things in between. And as you pointed out, there's all kinds of causes for those things in between. And you made a point, you were talking about, I was thinking in terms of, you mentioned the chemical imbalance. Something's wrong in the way your body's producing the chemicals to keep our lives on balance. And as you say, you can get a medication to put the balance back, good to go. That's a physical symptom. But the situational one, I hadn't thought about it. But, basically what I think you're telling me, or at least I'm picking up, is when people seem to lose hope, they're open to depression. Is that fair?
Yes, that could be it. And that may be a temporary emotional condition. And maybe they've lost hope because they've been trying all sorts of things that haven't worked, and perhaps they have not hit on the one thing that would work, or there's a kind of predisposition to be very pessimistic about whether or not something will work in their life.
Now, when you say about losing hope, but thinking there's nothing you can do about it kind of thing, you mentioned one possibility is losing your job. And now that impacts you financially. It impacts what you can and can't do. It impacts what you might buy for groceries. It impacts whether you have lights on or a roof over your head. It impacts all those kinds of things. And, that depression can lead to some very serious situations. And we often hear social service folks and police folks and so on talking about the homeless having suffered the total absence of hope in their lives, and as a consequence find themselves facing difficulties that end up occasionally with the police ending up being involved and incarceration being the solution, when in fact that's no solution at all, is it?
Oh, Lord, no. No, not in that situation. Not at all. And there have been experiments in which people who are homeless have been provided with free housing or housing that is geared to income. And there are lots of stories of real turnarounds as soon as people have a place to live that is secure. So sometimes there is actually a relatively accessible, practical solution that enables people to move ahead with their lives in a way that they couldn't otherwise. Of course, this is something that has to be publicly funded, so there's a lot of caution around doing this on a widespread basis because taxpayers are paying for it, et cetera. So we end up with a political will kind of situation around whether or not we can do that kind of thing. But yeah, sometimes fairly simple changes in circumstances can result in a substantial change in how people feel and how they're able to live.
And how they respond to how they feel is, yeah. And I recall talking with you before, you talked about generational trauma, where families can, in fact, sort of, pardon the expression, breed the trauma into the family because of their living circumstances. And I find myself going back to the lack of hope again. There were a number of studies done, and particularly some polls done in high schools. Now, I'm going back a few years now, but I remember so vividly the big high school in Truro, which happens to be, I think, the second largest school in Nova Scotia. And they did a poll there about, the prospects for the future for these young people coming out of high school and where they might go to, build their careers. And the poll was overwhelmingly suggesting that they had little or no hope. And it marked the first time ever the generational response was so bleak. And I wonder, given, the circumstances of our economy, the threats of wars, the threats of job losses, the threats of all kinds of things that we're suffering today, if we're not facing an entire societal problem of depression and or worse.
Well, interesting that you should say that, because at a recent trauma conference that I attended, one of the speakers said trauma is political.
Wow.
So yes, you're right. When the circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances, are such that people cannot feel secure in jobs or their ability to earn a living, then you will get something like that hopelessness and that giving up, and it's happening today. One of the teachers that I've talked with in Oxford sees that happening in the school here, that youngsters are leaving high school and they have no particular ambition to go anywhere. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that when there is economic instability, then what is there to hope for? Everything that you start to build up is going to get knocked down, that kind of thing. But and then that certainly attitudes of parents, grandparents, great-grandparents get carried on down through generations. But intergenerational trauma is even more complex than that, because there are also other behavioral patterns that get passed down through generations that affect youngsters. And so there's a whole range of attitudes and behaviors. But yes, the economic climate can very much influence that. And I think it has, certainly in Nova Scotia, and I suspect throughout Atlantic Canada, that this has been a factor that has been really active in people's lives.
Indeed, there's always been a perception that Atlantic Canada has, lower incomes and lesser rewarding jobs, and perhaps even lesser happy lives. I'm not sure, but there's always been that perception. I'm not sure I agree with it, but then when you live here, you don't want to agree with something like that. But talking again,
no, and it's not entirely true either. I mean, we moved here from Toronto because of the life. The life did not rely heavily on the sorts of economic situations that it does in cities. Like Toronto is a very corporate city, so there are a whole lot of values that govern life in Toronto that don't govern life here, and this was what we wanted.
As in personal values, family values, and particularly neighborly values.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and even the entertainment. Like, people don't spend a lot of money on entertainment here, where you do in a major city. Like,
But you're highly entertained. I know you are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back to
a lot of fun without spending a lot of money.
Exactly. And I mean, I used to say to people from Toronto, they'd say, well, where do you go to watch a movie? And I say, well, we have a theater. And they say, just one? I say, how many movies can you watch at the same time? We only need one. You only need one that's playing something you want to look at, You don't need a multiplex where you go in and, wander around and suffocate with the smell of popcorn. But
right. Yes, exactly.
Anyway, we're off track on that one. I want to go back to your statement about trauma can be political. And, of course, it can also be financial. We're touching on that. And those people who care, the people over the years who have worried and had not compassion, but more than that, for people who were living near the poverty line, would have argued quickly that poverty is a leading cause of depression and other melancholy and so on. And, we're facing some pretty difficult economic times. But over the years, too, the people who felt for folks in that situation, they got nicknamed the Bleeding Hearts. So it would appear that our society is somewhat divided on those who really don't give a damn and would belittle those who do. Is that a really fair statement?
Kind of. I have a tendency to feel that the people who talk about the bleeding hearts, etc., have had to face some pretty harsh realities, and they have found a way to sort of cut off the unhappy feelings, if you will, that are associated with that. And they sort of soldier on by doing a kind of a stiff upper lip thing. And so then they find people who are not able to do that. It's like looking in a mirror, that's what I could have been, sort of thing. So they can be very harsh about it. But really, it's because they have found a way to not be defeated, do you see?
No, I have to.
Other people are not quite, they don't go in that direction.
Now, I have to confess something here, that part of the reason I was asking these kinds of questions is that fresh in my mind is the fact that tomorrow there's a major conference taking place, 4 different locations and online, called Rebuilding Hope. And it stems from the Supreme Court directive that governments right across Canada, but in Nova Scotia as well, had to disband these homes for special care, where people with disabilities or challenges have been housed for years. And the court said that's not appropriate. That's not a humane approach. You have to do something different. And I talked with the minister responsible for the conference tomorrow. We talked about how, in particular, we think of the Sunset community in Pugwash and its reach into Oxford, and how they're trying desperately to serve the needs of their clients, as they're called, and that now we're going to close out those big homes for special care, arguably the place where people were put to be out of sight, out of mind. and instead treat them as one of us. And it lays on my heart rather heavily. And in fact, my editorial comment today is about that. And I look at that thinking, isn't it ironic they call it rebuilding hope for people who live in homes for special care? Because the society we live in would appear, going back 200 years when it was even worse how we treated those folks, going back 200 years, we would just as soon not look at the issue. But the Supreme Court has dragged us kicking and screaming into the reality that what we were doing was wrong, and we're taking a new approach. Is that kind of in your profession too, some new approaches?
In my profession, actually, there seems to be a different direction, which is the government decision, recent government decision to enable people with mental health difficulties to access therapists outside of the standard Nova Scotia mental health facilities. So, in other words, people who are not employed by addictions and mental health can, people can access therapists outside of that particular structure. So, in other words, the access to mental health help has expanded. So this decision that you're talking about is kind of shocking, because it seems to be going in quite the opposite direction. So I don't know. I know that there isn't enough help for people who have some sort of emotional or psychological difficulty. There's the waiting lists are very long. It's very hard to access the proper services, but that was a step in the right direction. So this seems to be a step in the opposite direction from what you're telling me.
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction. We close the big homes and have these patrons of the big homes move into smaller facilities of their choice, of their liking, in locations where they want, seeking to take part in the community services and become part of the community. So in that way, I think...
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I had the wrong impression.
Yeah, and so on that point, the old saying, it takes a village to raise a child, of course, but it takes a village, It takes the community to properly raise everybody within the community. We have a responsibility, a responsibility that was very dear to the hearts of most people in a neighborhood sense when I was a kid and beyond. But today, nobody wants to get involved. They don't want to touch it. They don't even say hi anymore. Are we our own worst enemy?
We could be. Sometimes we are, yeah.